Okay. Good evening and welcome to ICLO-NLS, a Lacanian reading of Freudian case histories. This is the second seminar in the series by Joanne Conway with Susan McFeely and myself, Linda Clarke, and you're very welcome. I believe there are over 100 people subscribed to the seminar this evening from all parts of the world, Bulgaria, Philippines, India, France, Greece, Pakistan, Canada, Ireland, Russia, and Iran, amongst others. 115 participants registered. Okay. So we're going to allow a few minutes just to make sure that everybody has gotten in, has connected, and then we'll begin. Perhaps while we're waiting, I'll make the introductions. That might be a good idea. So I don't know what way you're seeing people on your own screens, but Joanne Conway is a psychoanalyst in private practice in Dublin. She is current chair of ICLO, Society of the NLS, member of the new Lacanian School and the World Association of Psychoanalysis. She's also a member of API and the former editor of the journal Lacanian. She has also lectured at master's level for several years in Ireland. And then our other colleague, Susan McFeely, is a practitioner of psychoanalysis in private practice in Dublin. She's a member of ICLO and is also a member of its current bureau. In fact, the three of us make up the current bureau. Susan has worked clinically in the area of addiction and mental health services. She continues to be involved in mental health service and policy development. And I suppose just to say maybe something about the format for this evening. So we'll begin with Joanne's seminar. As I said, it's the second in the series, the first having been held encore last November. So we find ourselves in a very, very different moment now. And I suppose just to say that given the particular moment in which we find ourselves, it was important for the Bureau to go ahead with this seminar to make psychoanalysis of the Lacanian orientation present and accessible in the public domain, and also to make a space within the virtual for a coming together, both locally and internationally, perhaps creating a different form of presence, a different form to what we're usually used to. So perhaps, I don't know, maybe we'll give a few more minutes. Do you guys want to say anything? Want to say hello? No.
Susan, do you want to go ahead and then I can follow you?
Thank you. Hello to everyone. Welcome to the seminar. We're very happy that you were able to join us here tonight. Hello to Alan from Berlin.
Yeah, very good.
Hello to Alan from Berlin. And ICLO is very happy to host the second of these seminars, which Joanne is actually going to give you an introduction to the previous seminar that we held. And we look forward to working with you tonight. Joanne?
Yep, thank you. There's probably going to be some repetition here, but and you'll have to excuse me looking to my right, but I'm reading from another screen. So all of this is quite new for all of us in terms of, as Linda says, working in virtual spaces, but it's really important for us that we can find a way to continue working. And I suppose the naming of this as a seminar is quite daunting for me, because for me it's really a work in progress, and it is something which I'll speak about now in terms of why we came up with this way of work, if I can put it that way, this evening. So I'll start reading from a text, and if you want to interrupt me, Susan or Linda, or speak, let me know. So I'll start, and we'll see how it goes. Okay. So thank you, Linda and Susan and the Bureau of ICLO-NLS for support the event this evening. I'd like to thank you both, first of all, for being here, because I can see you. That's very important. And to welcome and thank all of you who have joined us. As a little bit of a preamble and perhaps a context to this evening, this is, as Linda said and Susan, the second part of a seminar, the first of which took place in November in Dublin, which seems like a lifetime ago now. However, we deemed it important for ICLO members and participants alike, and to those of you joining us here for the first time, that we continue to have a space to come together, to work on texts, and to continue to make psychoanalysis exist in various ways. So we continue not as before, but as we are. The idea behind the seminar, when it was conceived, was to return to the Freudian case histories, to read them closely, accompanied with some of Lacan's commentary on them. It was conceived as a way to welcome those interested in Freud's work without having necessarily any background with Freud or psychoanalysis, to hear something about it. So that is why the reading of his texts are center stage this evening. Depending on how this evening goes and what you say about it après coup, we can invent something a little different perhaps for the future. But I haven't got to the end, and I'm coming back to the beginning. I've realized what I want to do for the next piece, because I realized that I needed a bigger boat. In other words, I couldn't do in 2 seminars anything that I thought I could manage within the time. So we can talk about that. So why should we be interested in Freud today? In the rush or urgency to understand Lacan, there can be a push to read Freud's work solely via the texts of Lacan and his interest in them, or of those within the Lacanian orientation, which I think leaves aside the richness and value of his invention. As the analyst Gustavo de Sal said at a seminar last Saturday, for him an orientation in terms of the Freudian field is crucial clinically. I am of the same opinion. In rereading some of the cases of Freud, we encounter not only his genius, his clinical and theoretical precision and audacity, but also his struggle in comprehending, his tenacity to make theory and clinic fit, and at times his struggle or his blindness to his own subjective position in the hampering of the treatment, or indeed as the cause of certain failures. However, the failures Freud lays bare to all who read his work represent some of the most valuable elements of teaching for us. Failures of, or within the treatment at certain moments, always point to the position of the analyst. Difficult lessons for those in clinical work, but nonetheless crucial and to be interrogated, put to work in one's own formation. That is in part the ethical position of psychoanalysis. In other words, one does not have the luxury of blaming the patient. I'm not sure if it would be audacious to say it, but I'm saying it anyway. Perhaps we can say that in reading Freud's work, we are readers of an analyst's information. Freud allows us to read those failures and be taught by them, just as he is. We can see by the addition of footnote after footnote that he never stopped not writing and working on his clinical cases, even when the treatment itself was ended. The case of Dora is one such example, and one that I will return to. The elements Freud draws out in the cases have many resonances and points of connection with the contemporary psychoanalytic clinic, its subject, and the position of the analyst. Freud taught Lacan a thing or two. We are sure to find the same if we take the time and effort to read him. Backtracks. To resume this seminar today, I will go back a little to trace the elements that we spoke of at the last meeting. In that meeting, the paradigmatic case of a fragment of an analysis of a case of hysteria, otherwise known as the Dora case, was our subject. We traced the beginning of Freud's interest in hysteria, the great epidemic of his time, from medicine to his transformative encounter in Paris with the great Jean-Martin Charcot, to his work with various practitioners of hypnotism, namely Bernheim and Lebo, to his dissatisfaction with his own results, which led him to his master Joseph Breuer and the so-called cathartic method. Then the etiology of hysteria was found in the concept of trauma, a strangulated affect which had to be liberated via hypnosis and abreaction, thereby freeing the patient from the multifarious bodily symptoms that afflicted him, and yet served as the stigmata of the trauma that was split off from consciousness. The paradigmatic case of Anna O, or Bertha Pappenheim, Breuer's patient, was to prove pivotal for Freud in terms of what he discovered in it in relation to the concept of transference and the central place that sexuality played in the origins of hysteria. By the time of the third edition of the publication of Studies of Hysteria, Freud and his master had parted company, the once eager student on his way to found psychoanalysis. What Freud discovered via the chimney sweeping or talking cure was in fact a mode of treatment whose sole tool was language. He discovered that language, words, had the power to both traumatize and heal. The seeds of this were already present in his work with Breuer, whose cathartic method required that the trauma that was forgotten be recalled and spoken. But now for Freud, trauma need no longer be an encounter with an overwhelming event in reality that remained in suspense, but rather an encounter with one's own thoughts, ideas, fantasies, or sexuality, an encounter with something in oneself that one would rather not know anything about, even at the cost of carrying suffering in the forms of symptoms. By the time Freud met Ida Bauer, or Dora, in 1905, or actually 1901, I should say, he had also written his theory of infantile sexuality. His approach to treatment changed based on his theory of sexuality and the concept of the unconscious, where the cure was no longer a classification of symptoms that needed clearing up, but rather an investigation into the relationships and the dynamic of relationships in the milieu in which the patient inhabited. Lacan, in his paper Presentation on Transference, forensically examines the Dora case and sets it out as a series of dialectical reversals, moments in which the patient's subjective position in terms of desire, jouissance, her objects, and truth is laid bare. In fact, for Lacan, the very structure of hysteria can be read here. Dora taught Freud a very valuable lesson in terms of the place of the analyst in transference. That is, it is a dynamic in which the analyst is included, part and parcel. And in part, Freud's ignorance of that is what caused the treatment to fail. Freud also faltered on the crucial element of the hysterics question about desire and femininity, and her confounding of the object of desire with that of jouissance. He railroaded the treatment along his own heteronormative lines, ignoring the question that held Dora in thrall, and which manifested via her interest with the figure of Frau K. Not as a person, Lacan tells us, but as a mystery of Dora's own femininity, just as the image of the painting of the Madonna and Child that captivated her. An ideal for the hysteric, the Virgin, who is also a mother, in the place of divine worship and a transcendent object of desire. And I'm quoting Lacan there. A transcendent object of desire and not an object of satisfaction or jouissance for the other. Dora attempted to interrogate these questions of her own femininity via Frau K and the constellation of relationships that surrounded her. But Freud's insistence about her repressed love for her K stymied the treatment and allowed her to take her leave of Freud. As Lacan says, and I paraphrase, Freud fell down the same trapdoor as her K, but with a much more insidious sliding. Freud realized it after the fact when he states, "I did not succeed in mastering the transference in good time." And in a famous footnote added in 1923, he states, I'm going to read it here, "The longer the interval of time that separates me from the end of this analysis, the more probable it seems to me that the fault in my technique lay in this omission. I failed to discover in time and to inform the patient that her homosexual gynecophilic love for Frau K was the strongest unconscious element in her mental life." And I skip down to the end and he says, "Before I had learnt the importance of the homosexual current of feeling in psychoneurotics, I was often brought to a standstill in the treatment of my cases, or found myself in complete perplexity." Sorry, I missed my place. So, something of the importance of the tie binding Dora to Frau K finally hits home many years later. It would be another 10 years before Freud publishes another case concerning a female. In 1915, he published A Case of Paranoia running counter to the psychoanalytic theory of the disease. However, one cannot really count this as a case history per se, as it revolves around his meeting twice with a woman in her 30s, a woman who is taking a lawsuit against a former love interest. Freud was asked to see this woman by her lawyer, who believed there was something pathological in her litigation. Freud's purpose in publication seems to be to verify his own theory of paranoia as being a defense against homosexuality. However, there's something that I wanted to extract here and perhaps we can return to. And again, it's something that at this point in Freud's teaching, it's very much along the paternalistic lines in relation to the importance of the father and the Oedipus complex, castration, etc. The mother is there, but her role or her function or her position is never really precised or considered by Freud. And this is something that I came across here, which I thought was quite interesting, particularly in relation to the case that we'll be looking at. So, in this case, Freud asserts that it is the girl's love for her mother that stood between her and her erotic satisfaction, disturbing her relations with men. And this is a long quote from this text. When a mother hinders or arrests a daughter's sexual activity, she is fulfilling a normal function, whose lines are laid down by events in childhood, which has powerful unconscious motives and has received the sanction of society. It is the daughter's business to emancipate herself from this influence and to decide on broad and rational grounds what her share of enjoyment or denial of sexual pleasure shall be. If, in the attempt to emancipate herself, she falls victim to a neurosis, it implies the presence of a mother complex, which is, as a rule, overpowerful and certainly unmastered. The conflict between this complex and the new direction taken by the libido is dealt with in the form of one neurosis or another, according to the subject's disposition. The manifestation of the neurotic reaction will always be determined, however, not by her present-day relation to her actual mother, but by her infantile relations to her earliest image of her mother. I think this is an important passage, and I hadn't come across it before until I was reading for today, in that it presages Freud's later recognition of the importance of what he will term the pre-Oedipal mother-daughter relation, something that would emerge in the 20s around the so-called Great Debate with the likes of Horney and Klein and Jones around female sexuality, which I'm not going to look at today, but that's, I just thought it was an interesting perspective. And also this idea of the emancipation of the daughter being at her own behest in some way. There's no mention of the father, which is interesting. So at this point, however, we can say that Freud is still bound to the myth of the all-powerful father. 5 years later, in 1920, he will publish what could be truly named as his second and only other detailed case of a female patient, some 15 years later after the publication of Dora's case. This is the case of the evening, the psychogenesis of the case of homosexuality in a woman. So, we may ask as we begin our exploration, I should say, has Dora been a good enough teacher? Openers. From the opening of the case history, Freud makes his position clear, that he will demonstrate via the material the origin of homosexuality in this case is psychical, and make evident the reasons for its emergence. And the use of the signifier psychogenesis in the title makes the psychical origin very clear also. Freud introduces us to his patient, whom he describes as a beautiful and clever girl of 18, who belongs to a family of good standing and is brought to Freud by her family. Again, echoes of Dora here. She is brought as a last resort in order to bring about a cure to her recent behavior, which is causing them concern. Of late, this girl has become infatuated with a society lady, 10 years her senior and of spurious repute. A cocotte is the term used in the text. This lady is living with and carrying on a homosexual affair with a married woman, whilst also engaging in promiscuous affairs with a number of men. The behavior of her paramour does not dissuade the girl from her devoted adoration with which she pursues this lady love, although she herself, says Freud, was by no means lacking in a sense of decency and propriety. She had gone against all prohibitions enacted to prevent her seeing this woman, and had given up all previous interests in her life. I'm just going to read a short piece here, 1:7, and he says, no prohibitions and no supervision hindered the girl from seizing every one of her rare opportunities of being together with her beloved, of ascertaining all her habits, of waiting for her for hours outside her door or at a tram halt, of sending her gifts of flowers, and so on. It is evident that this one interest had swallowed up all others in the girl's mind. She did not trouble herself any further with educational studies, thought nothing of social functions or girlish pleasures, and kept up relations only with a few girlfriends who could help her in the matter or serve as confidants. The parents also report that their daughter never showed interest in boys, and that this episode seemed to be a continuation in her recent interest in members of her own sex. For a number of years, this young girl had become besotted by young, attractive mothers, much to the anger of her father. However, recently, as Freud notes, the trait of motherhood was dropped as a requirement in her love objects. Freud notes two aspects of the girl's behavior that are particularly aggravating to her parents. On the one hand, an openness, indeed one might say public exhibition of her infatuation, whilst on the other, lying and deceitfulness in order to ensure her ongoing pursuit of this woman. This hiding and showing, this deception and truth, are of extreme importance in terms of this girl's subjective position, and one which Freud will encounter in the treatment. Whether he knows how to read it and make use of it is another matter. I'll read an important part of the text here. It's on page 148. Okay, and it says, and I'm repeating a little bit, but it's an important passage. There were two details of her behavior in apparent contrast with each other that most especially vexed her parents. On the one hand, she did not scruple to appear in the most frequented streets in the company of her undesirable friend, being thus quite neglectful of her own reputation. While, on the other hand, she disdained no means of deception, no excuses, and no lies that would make meetings with her possible and cover them. She thus showed herself too open in one respect and full of deceitfulness in the other. One day it happened, indeed, as was sooner or later inevitable in the circumstance, that the father met his daughter in the company of the lady about whom he had come to know. He passed them by with an angry glance, which boded no good. Immediately afterwards, the girl rushed off and flung herself over a wall, down the side of a cutting onto the suburban railway line which ran close by. She paid for this undoubtedly serious attempt at suicide with a considerable time on her back in bed, though fortunately little permanent damage was done. After her recovery, she found it easier to get her own way than before. The parents did not dare to oppose her with such determination, and the lady, who up until then had received her advances coldly, was moved by such an unmistakable proof of serious passion and began to treat her in a more friendly manner. So, the consequence of this attempt, as Freud said, was twofold: a certain restraint in terms of the parents, particularly the father, in terms of his anger towards her, and a certain defrosting of affection from her beloved, who up until now had treated her with coldness and rejection. Freud pauses here to give some insight into the effect of the girl's behavior on her parents. The father he describes as an earnest, worthy man, at bottom very tender-hearted, but he had to some extent estranged his children by the sternness he adopted towards them. He is a man devoted to his wife. And again, I think as I was preparing for this, that this is a very important aspect of the case. However, his daughter's behavior has certainly caught his attention. She is firmly under his gaze. Initially, he flew into rages and used threats to suppress her behavior. He vacillated between thinking his daughter a degenerate or mentally afflicted. Something about his daughter's homosexuality aroused, said Freud, the deepest bitterness in him, and he was determined to combat it with all his power. About the mother, Freud describes her as neurotic, a mother, who favors her 3 sons over her only daughter, with whom she is decidedly harsh. She is a youngish woman who's unwilling to give up her claims to attractiveness. However, her attitude to the affair only seemed to pertain to the harmful publicity and damage to their reputation. She was not angry about it, and in fact, says Freud, she had enjoyed her daughter's confidence concerning her passion. So it's had a number of effects on the various people within the household, so to speak. So, despite the low estimation of psychoanalysis in Vienna at the time, Freud tells us, 6 months after this suicide attempt, her father, as a last resort, decides to consult Freud, basically to bring his daughter to reason, again echoes of Dora here, and if that failed, well, the father would cure her by arranging a marriage for her. Freud is quite aware of the issue of carrying out an analysis to satisfy the demand of the entourage, as Lacan puts it in Seminar 4. Freud makes clear that one doesn't do an analysis on command the way one constructs a villa. And that's from Lacan, by the way. For Freud, excuse me, I'm going to sip water. For Freud, and this is a quote, the ideal situation for an analysis is when someone who is otherwise his own master is suffering from an inner conflict which he is unable to master alone, so that he brings his trouble to the analyst and begs for help. That's the ideal situation. This is not the case here. In fact, this girl Freud tells us, has no hysterical symptoms, no pathological history, and is only concerned about her homosexuality in terms of the distress it causes her family. So there is no will in terms of this daughter to change other than in relation to the parental couple. So here, says Freud, the task in question is not resolving neurotic conflict, but rather a conversion of genital organization of sexuality from one to another. He is quite clear from the outset that attempting to convert a homosexual into a heterosexual is nigh on an impossibility, just as would be the reverse situation. In fact, for Freud, homosexuality consists in a subjective choice of object, just as is heterosexuality. Therefore, there is no disorder or neurosis, and the chances of undoing said choice in favor of another, for Freud, were not likely. And again, in the text, he speaks about a number of cases where he has worked with people who are trying to undergo analysis in order to cure their homosexuality, and he speaks about that in great detail. So Freud was not hopeful. He conveys this to the family, and he says he doesn't hold out much hope for their wishes to be fulfilled. Nevertheless, he agrees, I quote, to study the girl carefully for a few weeks or months in order to ascertain whether psychoanalysis will be likely to influence her. And it's here that Freud tells us of his conception of analysis at this point, that it comprises 2 phases. The first comprises the reconstruction of the disorder by the analyst as it emerges in the material the patient presents. The analyst interprets this for the patient based on the postulates of psychoanalysis, so that the second phase can commence. Here, the patient himself gets hold of the material presented by the analyst so that he can work on it himself. It is only through this work that resistances can be overcome and the inner change aimed at is made possible, leading to an independence from the analyst's authority. In other words, it's not enough for the patient to show up. Consent is required, and that pertains to a consent to an encounter and a consent to interrogate one's own unconscious. It is not about the filling in of forms, as many of us may have encountered in the past while. For Freud, this treatment did not continue beyond the beginning of the second phase, and the second phase being where it is over to the patient to continue the work in terms of resistance and overcoming of resistances, etc. So, beginning the treatment. Despite his telling us that the treatment was stymied at a certain point, Freud has no doubt in stating that from the material that emerged, he confirmed the constructions he made in relation to the origins of her homosexuality. At the opening, Freud tells us that this girl's love was platonic. Her genital chastity, as he called it, remained intact. In fact, she reveals that her beloved had treated her coldly and had never allowed any greater favor than to kiss her hand. In fact, her beloved had consistently done nothing but reject the girl's advances up until the time of the suicide attempt. The attitude of the beloved did nothing to dissuade the girl from her devotion, and Freud also notes here a certain elevation of this woman to that of an exalted object, that despite the current reduction of her circumstance, and this is the girl says she was someone of good birth and noble origins, the girl insisted on the purity of their love. For Freud, the girl's manner of loving is one that he specified particularly in two papers: a special type of object choice made by men in 1910, and on the universal tendency to debasement in the sphere of love, 1912. He outlines the origins of the choice of love object by certain men, the choice of a love that evokes a certain impossibility, and that finds its origin in the tie to the mother and rivalry toward the father. In addition, there is found a degrading of the object that is tied to the fantasy of rescue, that the man will rescue his beloved from her denigrated circumstance. In this young homosexual girl, Freud characterizes her love along those lines. He says it is a necessary condition for love that the lady have a bad reputation, and in previous episodes, there were women who were not themselves homosexual, so there was no possibility of homosexual satisfaction. So she loves like a man, a love that by its very nature will be frustrated, and that is its essence. A frustration of the drive in terms of the object, we could say, is its satisfaction. He characterizes it along the lines of the masculine type of object choice, a type of chivalric love, the knight and his lady, of which Lacan will make more. Freud emphasizes yet another point pertaining to the treatment itself. What could support an analytic treatment when this girl herself is not troubled by her homosexuality and could not conceive of being in love in any other way? She was frank about this with Freud and stated that she wished to undergo treatment for her parents' sake. Freud sees this as a good start, but adds that he did not see, and this is a quote, the unconscious affective attitude concealed behind it, which would, he says, determine the premature end of the treatment. So before I continue, I just wanted to read or speak a little bit about castration and the Oedipus complex. I'm sure most of you who are joined with us this evening know a lot about this, but it's just for those that haven't, because it's important, I guess, to understand something or hear something of it in relation to how Freud will interpret the case. So that's why I just wanted to briefly, it's a paragraph, and I hope not too painful for you. So Freud will read this case through the lens of the castration and Oedipus complexes. We know initially that Freud will maintain a symmetry between the boy and the girl, which he will later revise. The path for the girl to reach genital organization and to access the feminine position is far more complex than for the boy. His paper of the 20s, Infantile Genital Organization, Dissolution of the Oedipus Complex, and Some Psychical Consequences, etc., demonstrate this. Freud specifies that there is a long prehistory of the Oedipus in girls, and maybe, he says, in the 20s, it may be a secondary formation. For the girl must change not only her primary love object, the mother, in favor of the father, but she must also change her primary source of libidinal satisfaction, that is, from the clitoris to the vagina. The fact of castration is what precipitates the girl into Oedipus and heralds her move away from the mother, who has disappointed her by not furnishing her with a phallus. She knows she is without it and she wants it, i.e. penis envy. The sentiment of disappointment and anger is what for Freud confound the relations between mothers and daughters. She moves to the father as possessor of the phallus. In other words, is on the basis of an identification with the father. When she fails to receive what she wants, the wish for the penis is converted into a wish to receive a child from the father. Over time, the girl realizes that this will not come to fruition, and so the girl can retain this wish unconsciously, that is, to have a child from the father, and the path to femininity is open to her. Or she can refuse to accept her castration in the form of the masculinity complex, or she can disavow the fact, which, says for Freud, is common in children, but in adults would herald the beginning of psychosis, where she convinced she possessed the penis, that she's not without it, and that she's compelled to behave as though she were a man. The Oedipus complex is not smashed for the girl in the same way as the boy, but more or less peters out or fades away over time. It is never fully realized in the same way as the boy. So with this lens, Freud tells us that from all appearance, this young girl was proceeding along the path toward the feminine ideal, as evidenced in her affection for a young boy that she befriended when she was 13 or 14. This for Freud indicated a strong desire to be a mother and have a child. There was no trauma or pathology in childhood, no hysterical symptoms. The birth of a brother when she was 5 appeared to have no consequence for her. However, she became indifferent to this boy, and her libidinal interest diverted towards an interest in mature but still youthful women. It was then that the anger and gaze of the father emerges. What triggered this change from what Freud terms as her maternal attitude was the birth of a younger brother when she was 15 or 16 years of age. Here, Freud says, was the appearance of a wished-for child from the father, but it was the mother, and not she, to whom it was gifted. This event triggered a homosexual position fixed on older women. For Freud, the case is quite clear. Initially, the women she pursued were young mothers, a substitute for her own mother, the primary love object for the girl. And is it important to note that these women were not homosexual? So it is clear that impossibility of a love of this kind is always an aspect of her choice. Whilst the trait of motherhood was dropped later in terms of her current beloved, Freud noted that her lady love also has traits of the girl's older brother, thus for Freud demonstrating that the choice of love object will combine both a homosexual and heterosexual satisfaction. evidencing for Freud the universality of sexuality in human beings. In other words, there is no true masculinity or femininity. Freud looks to the relationship between the girl and her mother. We know that it was one in which the boys are favoured to the detriment of the girl. And, says Freud, this girl had little cause to feel affection for her mother. One can deduce from this that this mother, who is unwilling to give up her good looks and attention from men, saw her beautiful daughter as a rival. And Freud notes that the mother was particularly watchful over the relationship between the father and her daughter. We have here, I think, echoes, perhaps, of something akin to Lacan's idea of ravage. For Freud, this taking up of the homosexual position is a solution, although he doesn't put it like that. That was me, so we'll talk about that maybe later. In his account, the girl experienced a revival of infantile, Oedipal wishes at puberty. And this is when she suffered this disappointment, the birth of the brother. Consciously, she became aware of the wish to have a child, and a male one, which belied that unconscious wish that she desired to have her father's child and an image of him. But it was the mother who bore this child, precipitating her into a turn away from the father and all men. Here, says Freud, she forswore her womanhood and sought another goal for her libido. In her turn to homosexuality, she, on the one hand, leaves the field of men open to the mother. She retires in favour of her, says Freud. And on the other hand, the homosexual position serves to enrage her father, exact revenge, and at the same time serves to keep him close. She ensures she is always under his gaze. For Freud, the girl has regressed to an identification with the father, loving as a man does, and taking her mother in favour of her father as love object. The choice of the mother as object, said Freud, is an attempt to revive her earlier love for her mother and overcompensate for the current hostility she harbours for the mother. So she searched for a mother substitute who, in its latest guise, turns out to be cold, aloof, and offers nothing but repeated rejection. I'm just going to get a drink in a moment. Heading for the fall. I previously read the scene, the moment that precipitated the girl's jump from the bridge. She had arranged to let herself and her lady love be seen by her father, knowing it would result in enraging him, but also imposing a certain impotence on his authority. His furious look ensues, causing perplexity in the girl and the rejection of her love, her beloved, who then ends the relationship when she discovers who this personage is. The girl tells her that it's her father. She tells Freud that it is the ending of the relationship that causes her to jump. But Freud finds two other motives behind this explanation. For Freud, it was the fulfillment of a punishment, a self-punishment, and the fulfillment of a wish. The second motive, the fulfillment of a wish, pertains to the signifier niederkommen, a German word, which Freud notes means to fall, or also in common parlance means to be delivered of a childbirth. In the enactment of the fall, this young girl realized the wish that was denied to her in reality, the wish to have a child by her father. Now she fell through her father's fault, and that's a quote from the text. For Freud, the moment that the lady forbade the continuation of the relationship, she uttered the same prohibition as that of her father about the relationship, connecting her conscious idea of the loss of the beloved with the unconscious wish pertaining to her father. The self-punishment that Freud locates here is also related to death wishes that the girl unconsciously has in terms of the mother. Freud asserts that in every attempt at suicide, there is an attempt to kill another, an attempt to kill an object with whom one is identified, and this wish is turned against oneself. Freud reveals that the girl herself did not implicate her father in terms of her suicide attempt, nor did she reveal any fear of his anger. So in the explanation of this, it wasn't the father that's named, it was her beloved that was named as the cause. But Freud, as we hear, isn't happy with that. So the material, he says, that emerged in the treatment for Freud specifies that it is the father who plays the principal part. Her attitude, and this is a quote, of defiance and revenge against her father was the principal motive for her holding fast to her homosexuality. And it is this attitude, said Freud, that will determine the course and length of the treatment. And one could ask there, who is directing the treatment with a statement like that? It's quite interesting. So, where am I? Outwardly, she was concerned for her parents' distress and wanted to alleviate it by undergoing treatment in an attempt to be transformed. That's Freud's words. And there appeared little resistance. Freud says she was participating with her intellect and otherwise remained disinterested and untouched by his interpretations. And this is a quote. When I expounded to her a especially important part of the theory, one touching her nearly, she replied, how very interesting, as though she were a grand dame being taken over a museum and glancing at objects to which she was completely indifferent. For Freud, this points to her revenge against her father as a factor that engendered what he terms as her cool reserve. The dashing of dreams. It is this position in relation to the father that will cause the end of the treatment. That is, Freud's relation to the father and not his patient's. For Freud, the first phase of the analysis has been traversed. That is, where the analyst gathers all the material from the patient and makes powerful interpretations and explanations based along analytical lines. When it is then, in the second phase, the part of the patient to work through in order to gain insight and freedom from the suffering that afflicts him. Phase 2 did not commence, according to Freud. He says something quite particular, and one I hope maybe we can discuss. Initially, he says, no transference to the physician was effected. But then says, well, of course there was, but maybe it wasn't the type he wanted. He says, in reality, she transferred to me the sweeping repudiation of men which had dominated her ever since the disappointment she suffered from her father. It need not evoke any violent emotional manifestations. It simply expresses itself by rendering futile all his endeavors and by clinging to the illness. Again, one cannot help but be haunted here by the ghost of Dora. He goes on, as soon, therefore, as I recognized the girl's attitude to her father, I broke off the treatment and advised her parents that if they set store by the therapeutic procedure, it should be continued by a woman doctor. And just like that, the game was over. But there is a crucial aspect that Freud reveals and is most telling in terms of his position in transference, and which we will also read through Lacan. Freud locates an aspect, of positive transference in terms of a revival of the girl's original passionate love for her father. This emerges in a series of dreams in which the girl's longing for a man and desire for children is confessed. They, and I quote these dreams, anticipated the cure of the inversion through the treatment, Freud says, which is quite a remarkable statement considering the opening of the case and the little hope he had. So we can ask whose wishes were at stake here. But the content of the dream and what the girl said in treatment were in stark contrast. In treatment, the girl admits that she's quite willing to get married to escape her father's tyranny, but will continue to pursue her true inclinations out of his piercing gaze. As for the husband, well, she could have sexual relations with him and a woman, as the example of her adored lady showed. Freud makes an interpretation. He tells the girl that he does not believe her dreams, and I quote, that I regarded them as false and hypocritical, and that she intended to deceive me, just as she habitually deceived her father. I was right. After I made that clear, this kind of dream ceased. Freud saw in the dreams both a desire to gain his interest and good opinion, as well as one aimed to mislead him. But this is the critical point in the treatment. Of course, it repeats her position with her father, but it also shows something of her desire regarding the other, the position she takes up vis-a-vis the other. But Freud had already left the building. In connection with these deceptive dreams, Freud asks, can dreams lie? Does that mean the unconscious lies? This is nothing new in terms of dreams, he says. The dream is not the unconscious. Therefore, it is worked on by the primary and secondary processes. However, what he does not interrogate here is that the dream is the pathway to unveiling something of unconscious desire. And in terms of these dreams of his patients, he does not wish to travel down that pathway. So I'm going to pause here a little bit because I've spoken for a long time, I haven't realized, and move on to points that Lacan makes in Seminar 4. In terms of the seminar that we've started, we are trying to pace the reading of the case, that the Freudian text is primary, and that we are not rushing to elucidate it all with the entire oeuvre of Lacan, but rather we are trying to take moments in seminars and give them the space to talk about them, and then to move on, perhaps, if I'm allowed, in another meeting in relation to Seminar 10. So, rereading Freud. In Seminar 4, the object relation, Lacan considers both this case and that of Dora. In the lesson from the 9th of January 1957, Lacan characterizes this case as one of Freud's most brilliant and most troubling texts. Lacan highlights what is clinically striking. He notes that in the presentation of the childhood history of this patient, there is nothing remarkable. And then this, what he calls late flowering of an attitude, which appears frankly quite abnormal to all. The singular position that she occupies with regard to this ever so slightly denigrated woman. Lacan follows Freud's reading and extracts certain aspects, that of the suicide attempt, her attitude of deception, and Freud's interpretation and position in transference. It is this interpretation of Freud, just as in the case of Dora, that will set up his own defeat. He will also examine the type of love object, this is Lacan, that becomes all-consuming to this young girl. Lacan states that in the case of Dora, Freud intervenes at the time when he misconstrued her homosexuality. In other words, misread that it was oriented by a question pertaining to her own sex. In the case of the young homosexual girl, Lacan says there is, I quote, an analogous misconstruction, which is much more profound. For Freud, says Lacan, there is a complete reversal of subjective position due to the disappointment at the birth of the brother, causing a regression to narcissism and identification with the father. But Lacan notes, it is the appearance of this little brother that is the key point. How can that be interpreted? For Lacan, Freud's insistence on the aggression toward the father and attempted suicide after his disappointed gaze is not sufficient here. Lacan says it is not a return onto the subject of the aggression toward the father, but rather the suicide attempt is a symbolic act which accomplishes nothing other than the neither common of a child being born. In other words, one is dropped. This, for Lacan, is the original meaning of this situation. In his examination of Freud's account of the transference, Lacan is exacting. Freud correctly noticed the transference of the dreams and is not deceived by them. It is a repetition, he says, of the counter-lure game she played out in response to the disappointment of the father. She reproduces with Freud her fundamental position with her father. However, Freud imputes an intention here, an intention in her lying to captivate and make him fall. For Lacan, in reading Freud's account of the transference, there is clearly a counter-transference at play. And again, in relation to counter-transference and Lacan's idea of it, as he spoke about in the presentation on transference, that this is the sum of the bias and prejudice or lack of knowledge of the analyst at a particular moment in the treatment. That the counter-transference here is not, as in some other orientations, the feelings of the patient projected into the analyst. So I just wanted to clarify that. So he says that there is a counter-transference at play. Freud only holds on to the fact, he says, that the dream is deceptive. What Lacan points out is that what is essential is what is in the unconscious in the relation of the subject to the other. And he says this relation implies the possibility of being accomplished through a lie. In analysis, says Lacan, we are in the order of lies and truth. Freud knows this, and what he fails to do is interpret this desire of deception. Instead, he takes it personally. He immediately put himself on guard not to be duped by his patient. In other words, he puts himself completely in the middle of the treatment in order to avoid being deceived. For Lacan, Freud realizes the imaginary play, and he makes it real because he becomes part and parcel of it. Lacan specified Freud's interpretation to the girl when he tells her that he knows she's attempting to deceive him as the father. Here, for Lacan, the imaginary axis of the relation that Freud realizes, in the sense of cutting it down, he says that Freud interprets too precociously, rather than let his counter-transference serve him in a certain way. In other words, that he did not believe it, this counter-transference, in order that he not be in it. For Lacan, Freud makes the desire of the girl enter the real. And that was something I found quite interesting and difficult actually to try and understand, and maybe someone might enlighten me in this. So he says, he makes the girl's desire enter the real. It was not an intention, but a desire to deceive him. This, for Lacan, heralds the slide of the analysis into the imaginary. Freud makes the conflict break out, he says. He gives it body, when it was a matter of something completely different. And that matter was the revelation of the discourse of lies in the unconscious. Lacan furthermore comments on the nature of the devotion or attachment the girl has to her beloved. Freud had already marked it out as a manly form of love. It is a manlich love, as Lacan says, and it is a question of platonic love at its most exalted. It's a love that demands nothing other than to be in the service of the lady, or to the lady. It is, says Lacan, a courtly love in its most devoted form. It is the exaltation itself that is the basis of this relation. It is beyond attraction, beyond sexual desire. It is a love that aims precisely at non-satisfaction. And this is an important point. He says it's an ideal love that inscribes a lack in relation to the object. That is a love object that lacks something. Lacan says, where we see here a kind of knot moving from frustration to what he terms the symptom, or the enigma of what happens. What happens? Oh, sorry, I've lost my space. Sorry. First, the imaginary object as represented by the child received from the father. Here Lacan notes that female homosexuals invariably have formed strong fixations to the father. The crisis ensues at the appearance of a real object. In the form of the child, the father gives not to the girl, but to the mother. Then the reversal occurs. Lacan emphasizes here the point that the father is clearly installed for the girl. And again, I thought this was quite curious. The paternal presence, he calls it, the fundamental father, the father par excellence, he says, is on the symbolic plane. The emergence of a real child, the appearance of an object where it's not expected, and that it is the mother who is the one who possesses it, leads to a regression. What happens then, asks Lacan? A regression to the identification with the father, or is it rather she herself who becomes identified with what he calls the latent child, which can be neither common when the crisis reaches its apex? The girl's love, he says, aims at something other than herself. Freud locates this form of loving as a masculine experience of love, a masculine experience of a love of devotion, taken to its most elevated level. It's the fundamental disappointment that finds passage to the plane of courtly love. And what does the subject find in this form of love? What is desired in the woman, Lacan tells us, is precisely what she lacks. In this case, it is the primordial object for which the girl tried to find an equivalent in the child, an imaginary substitute. At the extreme, what is sought in the woman is what she lacks. What Lacan terms here as the central object of the whole libidinal economy, the phallus. What is at stake here is the collapse of identifications that sustain the girl until the arrival of the father's child. Yes, sorry. I'll redo that bit. What is at stake here is the collapse of identifications that had sustained the girl until the arrival of the father's child in reality. For Lacan, there is at first a structure of imaginary and symbolic elements that sustain the girl. A position, he says, that is classic and ordained by the theory. The imaginary child penis equivalent inscribes the girl as imaginary mother with regard to the father. A beyond intervening as the symbolic function, as the one who can give the phallus, he says. The power of the father, says Lacan, is then unconscious. This is after the decline of the Oedipus complex, and the father as the one who can give the child is unconscious. Then there is what Lacan calls the fatal moment, in which the father intervenes in the real by giving the mother a real child. And that this makes the imagined relation of the girl to her child something real. Here something can no longer be sustained for the girl. Her imaginary position collapses. And I'm very aware of time and me talking so much. And when I set out to look at the case in particular, and with Dora, and I wanted to also start to have a look at Seminar 10, and I realized there's far too much to try and to put into one evening. But there was just one thing that I wanted to highlight, which I thought was important in relation to when he speaks about Freud's handling of the transference. And again, the signifier niederkommen, which Lacan uses. And he uses this in the context of Freud. And he says that this is another repetition in the treatment, that Freud himself is guilty of dropping her. And this he also terms, if I remember rightly, and maybe someone can correct me, this is something he also terms as a passage à l'acte. So I'm going to leave it there and take some breaths, have some water, and yeah.
Okay. Joanne, thank you so much for your very thorough presentation. It was really, really interesting to return to this case, and thank you for the opportunity for it. As I had only really had the opportunity to read this case once before in my studies, so this is my second attempt at it. And it definitely is a case that there is a lot of ambiguity around. You know, there's a lot of questions, and it evoked a lot of questions for me, probably a lot more questions than understandings. And thank you for the very precise points that you actually have elaborated for us. But of course, thankfully, left it open as well so that we can have a discussion. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously at this moment, my aim is just to maybe ask one or two questions to begin the discussion, because as you've been talking, there's been some very, very good points being made, and it's really important that that each one is able to either include themselves via the chat, or even if they want to ask some questions to Joanne as well. So I suppose that the thing about this case that really interests me, of course, in relation to Dora as well, that it is a case where both women are brought to the treatment by their fathers. You know, they're not really bringing as a suffering of their own per se. And in particular, this young woman, one of the statements that really interested me in this case in particular of the young homosexual woman, is that one of her quotes, or one of the things that she says to Freud, is she could not conceive of any other way of being in love. And I suppose for me within this case, it was, and I know you said very well that, you know, there's so much that can be written about female sexuality and the choice of object. But it was a question for me, her choice. Do you know, it was a question of the solution, you know, from where it came. And you've actually probably answered a lot of it. But for me, I was looking at it again. I was trying to read it from the perspective of, like, as you say, it's a very, very poignant moment, the birth of this third son at a very particular age, because when I was reading the case, I was aware that Freud pointed out maybe at 13 or 14 she had a turning away from the child. She did become interested in these young, youthful women and, you know, mothers predominantly, obviously. And I wondered, you know, at that moment, because I was very, of course, I had a huge question, as I say, about her object choice, you know, and obviously I understand at that moment the imaginary collapses for her when this child is born, you know, that this construction of having a father for the child. And in a sense, she's dropped at that point too, isn't she, from the perspective of being the partner for the father, or, you know, or having being the, you know, having the child for the father, let's say. This, yes, absolutely. And she's dropped at that moment. And it was that really struck me, is these moments, as you call, of Niederkommen, in a sense. She loses her place there. There's also the moment of the enraged gaze of the father, and what happens at that moment where she physically drops. And of course, at that moment, I suppose it's very much the object, isn't it, in the sense of you know, this enraged gaze of the father. In a sense, she identifies with the object, I think, the gaze. And the imaginary falls again. And then, of course, the third fall is of course with Freud himself, when he ends the treatment. And I think it's a very particular signifier that travels the whole way through this case.
Absolutely. You know, and it's just to, I suppose, respond, because I know people as I read this again and again, there's something very enigmatic about this young woman and her position. There is something, and also Freud, like, there is such a turnabout in Freud from the case of Dora, whereby he dismisses or cannot, or as he says, stand still in front of this idea of homosexuality. It leaves him perplexed. And yet in this case, with this woman, it's a fact. That he wants to trace the origins of it. He does that, and there it's explained. But there's something very unsatisfactory in it, and I think that's in the case of maybe what, I can't speak for Lacan, of course, but there's something very troubling about it. And I think it's around that there is this position that Freud takes up, as Lacan says, about you know, her deception and her lying and all of those things that repeat. I mean, so there is at the one level a showing, a monstration, and that Lacan will talk about as an appeal or a call to the other. It's an acting out, all of this, look at me and this woman. And on the other side, there is the lie or the deception. And also what he says in terms of the fall, the gaze is something, or what is it he says? The gaze is something in terms of the father. She makes his presence there all of the time, but this disappointment, there's a he says, a confrontation between desire and the law as presentified by the father's gaze. And it's in that moment that he says she becomes identified with the object, with this thing that is dropped, that she falls out of the imaginary matrix, if you will, and maybe others can elaborate more on this, that sustains her position. And that is what she becomes identified with, you could say, as a waste object, perhaps. The thing that really struck me, and again is and I'll stop talking then, is around again this idea of consent and being brought, and you know, working in a clinic with adolescents as well. It is something that takes time to work through. But the other thing that also is important, I suppose, in terms of the contemporary clinic is also that the idea that the Oedipus complex happens at 4, 5, 6, and then that sets gender position, and I'm a man, I'm a woman, and all of those things in place are completely exploded in a way in this case. And it is what we see in the contemporary clinic, and it is what later Lacan speaks about in terms of puberty, where there is a real emergence of the real in terms of the drive, and that requires another knotting of some form. And I wonder, and I said I wasn't going to do this, but in terms of this woman, that's what also is so resonant for me in reading it, is that, yes, everything seems fine until a certain moment when it's not, and something collapses and falls. So that, you know, puberty is on center stage here, and she needs to have something to treat it with. And if she doesn't have access to, say, the symbolic, then what does she have? She has the real and the imaginary, perhaps.
There's a couple of questions here, Joanne, on the chat.
Okay.
So maybe if I start with Hara's question. In 1918, he starts analysing Anna. Can you draw a comparison between the two women vis-a-vis Freud's disposition towards them as their analyst and father?
Anna Freud on the child. Anna Freud, I presume, then the child is being beaten. Well, again, doesn't he send Anna off to see a female patient or a female analyst in? I can't really speak, because I was looking at this and also in terms of the child is being beaten in relation to, you know, the phallic phase and sexuality of the girl. But I suppose my plan, and I'm probably disappointing you, was to try and bring this through in terms of Seminar 10 and later work. So perhaps you can let us know if you have a response to that. I'd be interested to hear.
Okay, and then Marina has a question. It's, can you analyse the phrase, makes the girl's desire enter the real? It is important and enigmatic. Doesn't she have a desire of love? Do you believe that she only incarnates the love object A?
That's a very good question, and I have to think about it.
Well, we do have the question, so we the chat is saved. So,
okay. So the question is she only the object A?
Is it important? Yeah, it is important. Does she have a desire of love? Do you believe that she only incarnates the love object A? Object A.
I think that's a difficult one, and maybe, and it's one, Marina, I'll take up, because I'll follow, and maybe someone can respond, because when Lacan's speaking about her in relation to in Seminar 10, he uses the formula for the fundamental fantasy. So he uses something of desire and a call to the other in relation to the father on the one hand, and then this moment. So there's the stage that he speaks about, and then the world, and the moment where she's precipitated from the stage, where there is the fall and the passage à l'acte. So he mentions both, and that she uses what he says, her castration in the service of the woman. So again, for Lacan, and it's interesting, the whole idea of what's at play with this woman is quite enigmatic, and that's what I'm hoping to follow with the seminars, because in Seminar 4 he talks about her symptom in relation to this position with this woman as a perversion. Not that she's perverse, but as a perversion. And then later he uses the fundamental fantasy to describe her way of being in terms of the father of a monstration, and in terms of the other, and then this falling as pure object. So I can't answer your question in the right now, but thank you for it, and I will follow it. Maybe we can try and figure it out together over the next time. I don't know if anyone has any comment on that.
So sorry, I'm unmuting myself.
Hello, Francia.
Hello, hi everyone. This is Florencia. Because I couldn't find my hand to raise.
No, hands are missing, I think. I don't know where they are.
Okay.
So this gives a completely new topology of the body in the interaction. Thank you very much, Joanne and Susan, for this. I suppose what this question evoked for me is how difficult it is to disentangle the notion of the object when we speak about identifications on the one hand, choice of object in the sense of let's say the object choice in the Freudian sense, and the position as a sexuated being. Yeah, so the dimension of the drive and of jouissance. I think in Marina's question, the difficulty is that whenever we try to explain things in terms of attributing an object to desire, we fall prey of the imaginary, because it's not that the question is, what's the desire for? Desire for what? It's how is the subject constituted as desiring, and to what extent does that clash with the program of jouissance, which is precisely the partial drives and what you developed about the early identifications that determine object choice. So in fact, love, desire, and jouissance constitute a triad whose intertwining changes throughout both Freud's and Lacan's works. And I think one of the enigmatic aspects of this case is precisely to try and localize the moment of this passage to the act / acting out, because it's not clear that the other is constituted there as a gaze. That's what Lacan says as well. So we have all these contradictions that can't really be resolved in one answer. It's like a multi-layered scene that Lacan comes back to in various ways.
Thanks, Francia. And yes, and I suppose it's something that Lacan also speaks about in terms of Freud and his being stymied in relation to the transference, and that's something because he doesn't have a theory of the partial object, I think is what he says, in terms of the transference and in terms of what object he is in transference for her. So it may also, go around that question of love and transference also, and jouissance. But it's a very, as I say, we took it piece by piece, precisely so that we're not rushing ahead and using later Lacan to try and solve this, but to see the turns for him in the reading of this, and also the concepts that will come to develop over the work. So that was my hope. So I'm sorry I can't give definitive answers to things with people.
Okay. Susan, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, actually, I mean, Florencia kind of would have spoken to, again, one of the questions, that question, and I've seen it through some of the chats as well, that question of passage to the acting out, the enigmatic piece of that. And, you know, for me, it's not clear, you know, in the sense, like, it was one of the questions that I was going to discuss with you, Joanne, but I don't know if you had something more to say, but Florencia basically spoke to it. But speaking, I suppose, you know, Joanne, what you were talking about, the contemporary clinic, I suppose what struck me is this notion of coming to a treatment, and of course Freud sees it for what it is, you know, coming to a treatment to cure homosexuality, let's say, you know, and look, that's, you know, he speaks of it as how difficult it is. And I suppose there's a flyaway comment by him, you know, at the end of the actual case, where he kind of says, you know, maybe there will be a time where there will be a treatment, do you know what I mean, like. And I suppose what struck me very much was, you know, this notion, I mean, we've seen it, let's say, via Hollywood, these movies about these kind of camps where people are brought
conversion
to
therapy. Conversion therapy was only recently banned in parts of the States.
Yeah. You know, and I'm just thinking of Freud's flyaway comment, and yet it appears, but particularly in the contemporary clinic, this whole question, now we're talking of homosexuality, heterosexuality, you know, when we're in the time of maybe sometimes not a nomination, do you know what I mean, in a sense where someone doesn't want to be named as such, like even in regards to feminine, masculine, you know, male, female, you know, and even within the clinic where we see the fluidity of the object, let's say, to homosexual, heterosexual, and I use those knowing I'm using them wrong, but it's just a comment that struck me. Yeah,
it shows clearly, you know, what Freud has said from, you know, in terms of infantile sexuality and the three essays, you know, that the object and the driver merely solder together, that this is not something that is set in stone and given in terms of someone's sexuality and gender and identity and all those identifications Florence was mentioning, that they are things that have to be constructed in some way by the subject. And the very fact that there is, you know, for Freud, there is nothing natural about sexuality, because our sexuality is in ways corralled by the culture, society, and time, etc., that we live in. And it's very interesting in what you're saying, so that even in the most liberal of societies now, where everything is free and open, there is still an impossibility that you see in naming or being able to anchor via the signifier what that is.
Yes.
Because if it was clear to us, we would be able to name it and have a name. But it's the impossibility of a naming of sexual jouissance, of one's own identification as that, that always escapes. And femininity is something that also Lacan will speak about in terms of that. As he said, Freud expected that women could say everything. But of course they couldn't. And that's the thing he couldn't understand. It's the wall that he kept banging up against in terms of femininity and his trying to understand that too.
If perhaps we'll just take one further question, and perhaps we'll bring things to a close for tonight anyway. There's a question here from Asher. Can you please ask Joanne that when puberty hits, does or can the object of desire be identified as the self because of the somatic resemblance that a girl finds with her primary object of desire, i.e. the mother? Do you want me to repeat that?
Yes.
Along. Okay. Okay. When puberty hits, does or can the object of desire be identified as the self because of the somatic resemblance that a girl finds with her primary object of desire, the mother?
I think, again, and this goes maybe back to what Francia said about identification and object choice. In other words, you know, again, identification is for Lacan knotted in the three registers: real, symbolic, imaginary. And in terms of the imaginary, you have there, you know, in terms of the ideal ego, then the ego ideal. So there are many things that will start to specify something around identification. And there will be something of the mother that will be taken on by any subject, whether anatomically boy or girl. And likewise, in terms of as Freud says, you know, that there is no pure masculinity or femininity. There is no pure feminine object or masculine object, because they will always combine traits of more than one anyway. And so the object of desire, I'm not quite sure in terms of the question in puberty. I'm not quite sure what is being asked there. Certainly for Freud, at puberty, again, we're talking about the later papers in femininity, etc., that the child will take aspects in terms of the mother, but also of the father too. So it again depends on lots of things like castration or not, or, you know, so puberty is always a moment of crisis, but there are many things that underpin that. And depending on what the subject's position is regarding jouissance and castration and all of those things, there will be a different outcome. I can't really give a very definitive answer.
We can keep the questions and the comments for your next seminar.
Question. I had enough.
So I don't know. Perhaps it's time to.
Yes, and before you say, if we have the will to meet again, which I hope we do, I would like to, as I say, I want to follow these two cases through 4, 10 and beyond, but to start looking at the complexity of the concepts, that because we use them and again it really made me give pause for thought, and I didn't want to use the language either because it makes you think and work at it. So this has given me more to work on. But if people had questions, or if they want to know about text, or if they want to pose questions in relation to, or what they want to hear about, to send them.
Yeah, please let us know.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I suppose just on behalf of everybody, I just want to thank you, Joanne, for a very thought-provoking seminar, and for Susan for agitating the discussion and questions, and for everybody who's joined us here this evening. And I omitted it earlier, I'm very sorry, to say thank you to both Cecilia and Francia for registration, and for Francia for this evening supporting us technically on Zoom. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone who's asked questions that I probably didn't answer, and to all of you who've joined us this evening. And best wishes to everyone, and stay safe to everyone. And
before I forget, hopefully most of you or all of you will be joining us in the morning for the reading and commentary of Civilization and its Discontents. There you go, Discontents. And Susan is the reader tomorrow. So
fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.